For the remaining part of this discussion, I want to talk about the Roaring Twenties as it affected the African American population. The 20s was a critical decade for African Americans in the United States, and it is largely due to the phenomenon that comes to be known as the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance is a flowering of black culture and black pride in the inner cities, in the big northern and midwestern cities, focusing on Harlem, New York. And so it's a period in which black musicians and artists and writers and poets are making a name for themselves, but also simply expressing black pride in their history and heritage and the people that they had become. This was a terrifically important development and unprecedented in the history of African Americans up to that point. So, where does the Harlem Renaissance come from? How does it begin? Well, its origins lie largely in the developments of World War I and some of the things happening during that period. I described to you a little bit earlier the Great Migration, this movement of blacks from the South and into the big northern cities. The situation in the North was not perfect for blacks who made that move up to the North. And we'll come back later and talk about things like housing discrimination and job discrimination, racism among the police, and some of the issues that plagued life in those northern cities. But on the whole, I think there's a pretty good argument to be made that the situation was better in the North than in the South. Blacks had at least some opportunities for upward mobility. They were able to work jobs where they made money, made a salary, and perhaps most important, they could vote. You see political mobilization as one of the ideas here. Voting gave blacks power, gave them influence. And as the population in the North grows and grows, the black population, politicians began to have to pay attention to blacks because they're becoming an important voting bloc. World War I was also important in the sense that many blacks served and fought in the war. About 300,000 black soldiers served during World War I. And while they experienced segregation and some elements of racism in the military and the war, they also experienced life abroad and life in Europe, where racism was not such an issue. Many of these soldiers experienced a situation in which they were treated as equals. And so they came back to the United States wondering why they could not have such treatment at home. Similarly, these soldiers are fighting abroad, wielding a gun, firing upon people. It's a very empowering experience for each individual going through this. And so when they come back, they are less likely to accept things like Jim Crow and segregation just peacefully and lying down. They are accustomed to fighting and violence and to forcing change. I also mentioned to you previously the growing prominence of a number of black leaders who may have had different approaches, but who all were interested in seeing the black race move forward in this country and move up in this country. I talked about Ida B. Wells and Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, all of whom have achieved prominence and notoriety by the 19-teens. There is another of these black leaders that I have not mentioned yet, but who, for the purposes of understanding the Harlem Renaissance, is probably the most important of all of them. And his name was Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, who is pictured there at the bottom, and there's a picture of one of the rallies, the many large rallies that Marcus Garvey held on the right-hand side. I talked earlier about how Booker T. Washington was popular with whites because he spoke in terms of accommodation and accepting white dominance, at least in the short term. And W.E. Du Bois was popular with elites, Harvard educated, and he's speaking about the talented tenth. The argument could be made that it's Marcus Garvey who connected most readily with the black masses, the common black man in the country. His message connected better with average black citizens. So a little bit about Marcus Garvey. He was actually not born in the United States. He was from Jamaica. We see this with a number of the figures of this era, that he brought with him a more worldly view. And I think those who traveled or experienced other parts of the world had seen places where racism was not as prominent an issue, or as not an issue at all. And so they were perplexed and troubled by the prominence of racism in the United States. That's certainly the case of Marcus Garvey, coming from Jamaica. He arrived in the United States, traveled to places like Harlem, New York, and he brought with him a message of black nationalism and black pride. We might even see here the forebears of the idea of black power about 4 decades before that phrase really reached popular circulation in the country. Among his famous messages and phrases, he said, "Up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will." Well, this is a completely new and novel message. It's hard to express how novel an idea it was that blacks could take pride in themselves, that they could accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. In 1914, Garvey established the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Again, he was not from the United States originally, and so this organization was directed to, as he described it, Negro peoples of the world, all around the world. And part of his message was the so-called Back to Africa movement, the idea that those of African descent from all over the world could find a home back in Africa and could make their own way back in Africa. And the UNIA publicized this message in some part, and it also publicized the message of blacks supporting blacks. Buy your groceries in a black-owned grocery store. Eat out in a black-owned restaurant. Do your laundry and clothes in a black-owned laundry. And his organization helped to provide funding for dozens and dozens of these kinds of businesses so that blacks would in fact support themselves as they began to rise through society. Garvey's ultimate vision also proved to be his undoing. In the interest of this idea of back to Africa, Marcus Garvey actually went so far as to form a steamship line, the Black Star steamship line, with the intent of beginning to bring those of African descent back to Africa, to a colony in Liberia where they could live and thrive. He advertised this steamship line in his newspaper, which was called the Negro World. And for $5, blacks could purchase a share of stock in the Black Star steamship line, which also entitled them to a ticket on the line. More than 40,000 blacks invested in this enterprise. More than $1 million were raised in the interest of starting this steamship line. But it never came to fruition. There were all kinds of problems in the construction of the ships and getting the thing started, and so Marcus Garvey could not fulfill all of those tickets that had been sold. And so in 1925, the American government, which had long feared Marcus Garvey, you look at that scene on the right, here is a very militant man, he's talking about black pride, and he's preaching to crowds of tens of thousands of people and having these parades through the streets of New York City. The American government feared Marcus Garvey, and so they prosecuted him on the charge of mail fraud. This is a little bit like getting Al Capone on tax evasion. There were lots of things that the government wanted to nail Marcus Garvey for, but they got him on mail fraud because he had sold all of these tickets through the mail and did not fulfill them. He was convicted, served some time in prison, about 5 years, and upon his release was deported to Jamaica. And by that time, his influence had been eclipsed. But it's hard to understate or overstate his significance, the significance of his message in the Harlem Renaissance. It is a message of black pride, taking pride in black history and culture. It really lies at the core of what the Harlem Renaissance is all about. Garvey's message of black pride is picked up by other black intellectuals and writers and scholars, and again forms in some ways the groundwork for what becomes the Harlem Renaissance. Some of the other people that embrace a similar idea are pictured on the screen. Alain Locke, who is up in the right-hand corner, and Claude McKay in the larger picture. Both of these writers talk about an idea that comes to be known as the New Negro. Alain Locke is in some ways along the school of W.E.B. Du Bois. They actually come from similar backgrounds. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He earned a Ph.D. in philosophy from Harvard University. In 1925, he wrote an essay called The New Negro. And this was a play on the old sort of cartoon vision that was known as the Old Town Negro. This is the black man who is kind of bowing and scraping before the white man. Yes, sir, no, sir, this sort of thing. In The New Negro, Alain Locke says the Old Town Negro is dead. In his place is a new Negro. And this new Negro will not be submissive. The new Negro is educated. He is empowered. He insists on rising up through society. Claude McKay presents similar images in perhaps a different way. McKay was a poet, and like Marcus Garvey, he was originally from Jamaica, and so he's born and raised in Jamaica. He sees a different kind of acceptance of those of African origin, and he was already a promising poet when he moved to the United States in 1912. He arrived in the port of Charleston, South Carolina, the heart of racist southern United States. And he, of course, was not greeted as a promising poet on the rise. He was greeted as a black man and sort of pushed around. He was really stunned at the racism that just hits you right in the face as soon as you get off the boat in Charleston, South Carolina. He immediately wrote one of his most famous poems called To the White Fiends. Think you I am not fiend and savage too? Think you I could not arm me with a gun, and shoot down 10 of you for every one of my black brothers murdered, burned by you? Be not deceived, for every deed you do I could match, outmatch. Am I not Afric's son, black of that black land where black deeds are done? But the Almighty from the darkness drew my soul, and said, Even thou shalt be a light awhile, to burn on the benighted earth. Thy dusky face I set among the white, for thee to prove thyself of higher worth. Before the world is swallowed up in night, to show thy little lamp, go forth, go forth. So here he is in 1912, he seems to be suggesting that I could certainly retaliate with violence to the violence you give me, but I am better than that, and blacks are better than that. We're going to prove that by our actions. And yet gradually his opinions began to change. In 1914 he moved to New York, to Harlem, and so if he is part of the Harlem Renaissance, it's as a very early participant. And he lived there for a number of years as part of a community of writers in the bohemian village of Greenwich Village. And in 1919, from a distance, McKay observed the many difficulties in that very difficult year. Remember, this is the year the World War I has ended, the veterans are coming back, the blacks who had taken jobs in the munitions industries and so on were kind of being pushed aside. There was a great deal of racism and violence. One of the worst of the race riots in 1919 came in Chicago. 38 people killed, many of them black. 500 more injured. 1,000 homes destroyed. And in the aftermath of that riot, McKay wrote his most famous poem called "If We Must Die." If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. So his message seems to have changed a little bit. If we're going to die, if we're going to be persecuted, we are going to fight back. In the aftermath of this, McKay actually left the country. He moved to England, he lived for years in Russia, and essentially for the rest of his career, McKay was out of the country. So, again, if he's part of the Harlem Renaissance, it's very early, but he's definitely a part of getting that message out there of black pride and black culture, black history, taking pride in ourselves, and in some ways fighting back, not just turning the other cheek, but insisting on our place in life. And so these ideas form the intellectual underpinnings of the Harlem Renaissance. It is rooted in this idea of black pride and black self-expression, which, again, hard to overstate what a new and original thought this was. Blacks had known nothing throughout their history except repression and mistreatment and slavery and bondage and rape and all of these horrible things. And now they are beginning to hear a different sort of message. Take pride in yourselves. One writer described it saying, "Negro life is seizing its first chances for group expression and self-determination." The black writer Langston Hughes, who I'll mention again in just a moment, perhaps the greatest writer of the Harlem Renaissance, put it differently. In one of his essays, he said, "I am a Negro and beautiful." And again, what a new and different message that was. Another element of the Harlem Renaissance was that there needed to be a vehicle for getting this word out there. And so there were a number of black periodicals established and supported during this time. Many of the white newspapers and white publishing houses wouldn't publish work by black writers. And so blacks begin forming their own newspapers and publishing works that way. The best known of them was the NAACP newsletter called The Crisis. This was published and edited by W.E.B. Du Bois himself. And so it was Du Bois, interestingly, who first read and first published the works of many of the great writers of that age, including Langston Hughes. This does raise one of the issues that historians have wrestled with in terms of the Harlem Renaissance, though, and that is that in order to be successful, in order to become famous and in some cases wealthy and successful, these black stars had to appeal often to a white audience. If one was to truly make it, eventually, if you're going to be a successful writer, you needed to be read by a white audience. If you're going to be a successful singer, you have to appeal in some ways to a white audience. And many of the benefactors of the Harlem Renaissance were, in fact, white, either consumers or readers or customers or donors. There were a lot of scholarships created and grants created that came from whites but supported blacks. And so there are some cases in which black writers and artists and performers wrestled with sort of a conflict of interest. They wanted to represent black pride in its truest sense. They wanted to represent African history and culture, and yet white audiences didn't always want to see those things in their true form. And in some ways, if you're making money from this person and they are technically the boss, you might have to change your message somewhat. And so there are a number of instances in which black writers or performers were confronted with decisions to make. Langston Hughes, at one point, had to turn down a grant that he originally had started working under because the donor wanted him to sort of jazz up his writing with some of the kind of gross and cliched images of a hypersexual, black race. And Langston Hughes refused to do it and turned down the grant. But not all of the writers and performers had the luxury of turning down grants like that. So it's one of the elements of the Harlem Renaissance that scholars have studied.